All right, welcome everyone to our panel entitled Sex Work Policy Activism, Centering Trans and BIPOC Leadership. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kari Liram, and this event is in conjunction with my class called Sex Work, Human Trafficking, and Social Justice. I first want to express a warm thank you to the Harry Bridges Center for their sponsorship of this panel. This event is part of a year-long UW-Bothell Labor Colloquium series. You can register now for all the upcoming talks and events. And at the end of this event, we'll put a link to the registration in the chat. Just a heads up that next week we will have another event, 11 a.m. With Olaf Isingmaya, Punishment and Profit in Washington Prisons, organized by Dr. Dan Berger. So that's next week. I'm going to start with introducing our panelists for today. We'll start with Emmy. Emmy Koyama is the coordinatrix of the Coalition for Rights and Safety for People in the Sex Trade, and a founder of Eileen's, a community organizing and hospitality project for women working along the Pack Highway in South King County. Emmy is also a prolific writer. You can find a lot of her writing on her website, Eminism, and I don't know if Emmy, if you want to put that in the chat, but she's been a great resource for me and many activists and scholars for about 20 years, I think now. Tobi Hill-Meyer is an indigenous Chicana trans woman with 15 years experience working in the LGBTQ movement. She is the editor of the Lambda Literary Finalist anthology, Nerve Endings, the New Trans Erotic, author of children's books, including A Princess of Great Daring and Superpower Baby Shower, and director of the award-winning erotic documentary series, Doing It Online. Currently, she serves as co-executive director for Gender Justice League. Tobi is also joining us from the Oregon coast, where she is taking time out of her personal vacation to join us today. So a special thank you, Tobi, for joining us today. Okay, overview of the format. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the themes and concerns covered in this panel, and then pose a series of questions to each speaker. Please keep yourselves muted during this time. If you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat area. We expect that the panel may last up to an hour. We may be able to address some of your questions during the panel, but if not, we will leave some time, about 30 minutes afterwards, for a general kind of Q&A session. The panel themes. One theme that faculty organizers had in envisioning this colloquium series was to investigate how workers across a range of sectors have been impacted by COVID. Thus, the impact of COVID on working and living conditions of sex workers will be one backdrop to our discussion today. Within this context, we'll be narrowing in on 4 general themes. First, distinguishing between criminal justice and social justice approaches to sex work policy. Secondly, the ways that anti-trafficking laws and policies harm sex workers, in particular end-demand policies, and also how trans, queer, and BIPOC individuals in sex trades are particularly harmed by these policies. Third, the ways that BIPOC, trans, and queer sex workers are currently organizing to fight against these policies and more. And fourth, how labor activists can support people in the sex trade. Before turning to our speakers and our panel, I think it's useful to define a few basic terms that we'll be using in our panel. So first of all, sex workers. The Soros Open Society group defines sex workers as adults who receive money or goods in exchange for consensual sexual services or erotic performances, either regularly or occasionally. So focusing on adults, consensual sex workers. However, there are many other terms that people use. People in the sex trade is a term because not all people who trade sex for money or goods identify as, quote, sex workers. A more inclusive term that's sometimes used by advocates is people in the sex trade. This term includes everyone, regardless of whether they are trading sex by choice, circumstance, or coercion. Human trafficking is a term that many of us are familiar with. The U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act defines human trafficking by separating out sex from labor, hence reinforcing the idea that sexual labor is in fact not real labor. So the way that they define it is sex trafficking is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or when the person is under the age of 18. Labor trafficking also focuses on force, fraud, or coercion, like recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. Bottom line is that the definition of human trafficking across all sectors is that it must involve force, fraud, and coercion. In the United States, anyone under the age of 18 who trades sex is automatically considered a victim of sex trafficking, regardless of their circumstances. Finally, end demand, sometimes referred to as the Nordic model. This refers to ramping up criminalization of buying sex or people who manage sex workers while decriminalizing the selling of sex. The idea behind this is that women and girls who sell sex are victims and should not be criminalized. So the idea is kind of thinking about women and girls or the people who sell sex, cisgender in particular, well, men are imagined they're the ones who are the only ones who buy and manage sex workers, and those are the victimizers and should be punished. The logic is that if you punish them enough, this will end their demand for buying sex. Sweden was the first to introduce this model in 1999. Norway, Iceland, and Finland have since followed suit. The United States mostly criminalizes all direct sexual services or prostitution, except in parts of Nevada. But the Nordic model, or end demand, has inspired many popular campaigns, and we'll be discussing some of that today. All right, and if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat, mute yourself, and Simon, I think will be, Simon, my co-host here, thank you, will be managing and looking at that. All right, we're gonna start now with the panel questions. So the first question is around areas of criminal justice versus social justice. Very often when folks outside of the sex industry, including people in the helping industries, sometimes called the rescue industries, and the media, talk about the sex industry, they do so solely through the lens of criminal justice, punishing the bad guys, sweeping out the bad elements from neighborhoods, or using police officers to rescue victims. In contrast to this framing, which centers the police and the carceral state, sex workers are on the forefront of discussion, focusing on social justice strategies for relieving pain and suffering. And those are which center on reducing oppression and inequality. So as a way to start us out by thinking within this broad social justice lens, my first question is a very broad one into two parts. And Emmy and Toby, you can, I'm not going to direct this one to either of you. You can kind of jump in as you want. So I'll read them and then we can go through each of them. I want to know, why do you think it's important to go beyond criminal justice approaches to solve problems faced by sex workers? A follow-up is that what connections do you see in your advocacy regarding gender justice, racial justice, labor justice, economic justice? And how has COVID impacted these connections? So three big questions here, and I'm happy to repeat them if you need me to. Would either of you like to jump in and start the conversation?
I can start us off. So there's a lot to this question, and I kind of want to start by giving a little bit of background on perspective and the work that we do with Gender Justice League. So one thing that's very important to know is Gender Justice League, when we were founded, many of our founders are sex workers or have had history in the sex trade. And it's been a significant part of like our analysis of what trans justice looks like. We've done a lot of advocacy around sex work, and in the past year and a half, or actually 2.5 years now, we have been doing some direct services for survivors of gender-based violence, and doing that with the city of Seattle has given us a connection and specifically into some of the the work to support survivors of sex trafficking. And that looks very different in trans communities, but also one of the things that has really come up for us in talking with other advocates supporting survivors of trafficking is that a criminalization model really is about the use of force and manipulation. The criminal justice system really only can use force and threats of force for manipulation towards this idea of justice. And the difficulty with that is that there's often this idea of sex trafficking as like, you know, the thing that really shocked me, and I keep pointing back to, is one of the first episode of Daredevil, where he's like rescuing sex trafficking victims by literally going down to the docks and breaking open a shipping container, and a bunch of women in skimpy dresses and high heels come running out of the shipping container, which is just like such a ridiculous idea. But it really is that, you know, from that TV, from Law and Order and all these other places, there's this idea that sex trafficking is someone who like literally tied up and locked in a basement, when what we're looking at almost all of the time is something much more akin to domestic violence, something that is abusive, something that is manipulative, something that is really affecting someone and you know, putting them in a situation where they're going to be feeling like they have to continue to appease their manipulator. And the problem with that, and what we've seen from working around domestic violence, is that you cannot help someone escape domestic violence by becoming the new person who controls and manipulates them. You need to be able to help empower someone to make their own decisions, even if those decisions aren't the decisions that you would want to make. And so the problem with using the criminal justice system, the law enforcement system, is that police often as just needing to arrest the bad guy and everything's going to be okay. When oftentimes that can cause more harm to someone, and that you know, they'll even get to the point of where, you know, they see everything in terms of the bad guy and the victim. And if the victim is not cooperating, then they begin to think that perhaps the victim is also a bad guy, or maybe they need to use coercion, threat of force, threat of arrest, threat of violence to be able to coerce the victim into cooperating with them. And that this just in so many times it just perpetuates the cycle of abuse with the police as the new abuser. And that doesn't even touch on the reality that for so many people there isn't a bad guy and a victim, and that for so many people there is consensual sex work or any number of different gray situations where it's just not going to help to, like, it might be a situation where you know, there's someone who's doing sex work and they hire someone to do some of the administrative work, answering emails, booking appointments, and scheduling. And then the police see that person as the pimp and try to get the sex worker to help get their scheduler arrested, or all kinds of really confusing things that just don't make any sense in reality. And I think that there's deeper parts of this question I want to get to, but I want to talk to.
Thank you so much, Toby, and especially for reinforcing this kind of ironic situation where the police are essentially becoming the new traffickers of using force, fraud, and coercion. I wonder if either of you want to follow up on the question of COVID. So, you know, we've heard a lot about all the systemic issues that have nothing to do with policing, and policing can only actually reduce, you know, kind of create more harm. So social justice issues around, you know, needing more money, needing access to all kinds of resources. How is COVID impacting this in your observations?
I think just the one thing I want to add from a violence perspective, we've been seeing an increase in gender-based violence and domestic violence in particular. A lot of times people have been putting up with abusive environments that they are managing or trying to live with because the alternative is pretty scary too. And what happened, especially with the first lockdown, the first stay home order, is that people ended up in situations where their abusers were just keeping tabs on them 24/7. And, suddenly there's a legitimate reason to ask your partner, your housemate, whoever, why they are leaving the house every single time they leave the house. And that, like, it's almost expected that it's like, you should never ever leave the house unless you have a good reason. So you have to tell me what your good reason is. And just the intensity of a lot of situations have been at a simmering point that have boiled over. And that has led to increase of violence, and that has led to a lot of people dealing with, like, trying to leave or dealing with difficult things. And that's something that like we're especially seeing around domestic violence, and there's a huge overlap there between domestic violence and trafficking. But that yeah, I think, when we think about labor studies and the economic perspective of this, it just is so much. It comes down to, if you have money, then you can weather this storm. If you have resources, if you have, all then there are so many different ways that you can stay home safely. But if you don't have safe access to shelter, if you don't have money to cover your rent, utilities, and basic living expenses, then suddenly everything is so much more difficult, and so and near impossible sometimes. And so that's where a lot of the work that we've been doing, and a lot of the like directly supporting individuals, that's the impact that we've been seeing since COVID.
Thank you so much to both of you. I'm going to move on to the next question now, which has to do with disproportionate impact. Sex work researchers and activists have long known that trans, queer, and BIPOC individuals are disproportionately represented in the sex industry due largely to systemic racist and transphobic barriers to educational and occupational opportunities in general. As well, the bodies of trans, queer, and BIPOC individuals have a long history of being criminalized. As such, it's not a surprise that they are also disproportionately impacted negatively by anti-sex work policies. So my question is, based on both of your observations and your advocacy work, why is it important to center the voices of trans and queer BIPOC individuals in policies about the sex trade? Tobi, do you want to just continue?
Yeah, so I think, I was talking a little bit in the last question about the tendency of law enforcement to divide everyone up into bad guys and victims, or bad guys and people who are deserving of being protected. And I think that one of the things is that people of color and trans people are very frequently not seen as being deserving of being protected. You'll see the whole kind of rescue industry where people are kind of building up this idea that, like, you need to like break up the sex industry somehow in order to rescue people from themselves. And a lot of this is thinking about the young white cis girls who need to be rescued, and really playing on all of the fears and the racialized and the fears that come into play around that. But then when you're looking at people of color, and when you're looking at trans people, suddenly there's this like, oh, these aren't what victims look like. And so you'll see kinds of things where even in the framing of seeing sex workers as victims who need to be rescued. Trans people don't get treated sympathetically, but are seen as like troublemakers or problems or different things like that. And I think like there's one instance that really kind of exemplifies that, which actually we were talking about it earlier, and Emmy pulled up a blog post that she wrote back when this was coming out in 2012. But there was an instance in Chicago where they were doing a whole bunch of stings and arrests, and they were doing this kind of end demand approach where the idea was to push really hard on the Johns, the buyers, but to not really to be really like gentle, I guess, to the sex workers themselves. The problem though was that they would just kind of like arrest people en masse and send them down to the jail, and the jail would just kind of take this shortcut of being like, okay, here are all these people coming in. We're going to look at their IDs. And if their ID says female, we're going to say, oh, you're a poor innocent sex worker and not book you. But if your ID says male, then we're going to book you as a buyer and we're going to post your mugshot online. And so you ended up with trans women of color who were working as sex workers who then got arrested for soliciting a prostitute, and then would have their mugshot put online with their legal name, and really just be completely misgendered and then treated horribly. And so you'll see this again and again where it's like who is considered deserving of rescue, who is considered deserving of that kind of support. And so there's just so many different ways to trans people in particular are often profiled as sex workers. You'll see cases like there was one case that happened a few years ago where there were two Black trans women traveling to go to a funeral, and they stopped at a hotel, and the hotel looked at them and saw two trans women of color sharing a hotel room and assumed that they must be sex workers, and they had received a training on how to stop sex trafficking and what they should do in those situations. So they called the police, and the police came, and they didn't find any evidence of sex work, but they arrested them for having estrogen on them without having their prescription with them. And so you'll just see time and time again, even though there might be this rhetoric of like protecting the victims and like not going after sex workers, like that's not actually the case when you're looking at trans people, even when they're not sex workers. And so you'll see this disproportionate impact again and again in different ways. And it just becomes really important to be able to listen to the voices of BIPOC trans people, because we will tell you these things, and we will have these stories to share. If you're doing sex worker organizing and only listening to white cis voices, you might not even know these things are a problem. If you're doing like organizing from an anti-trafficking, pro-law enforcement perspective, and you're only listening to white cis voices, then it's going to be even more of a problem. And that's why, yeah, we really emphasize this in the work that we're doing, that centering BIPOC trans voices makes a huge difference in even just how you understand what the problem is before you even get to the question of what the solutions are and what actions and direct actions need to be taken.
Thank you so much, Toby. Those are two very powerful stories. And I know you've talked about these stories to policymakers too, and maybe we can, that'll be later on. We're talking about how these kinds of stories do or do not impact policy. Well, thank you so much, Emmy. It's a great segue to my next question, which is directly about sex worker organizing. So in my many years of observing and participating in the sex worker rights movement, I've seen many waves of sex work organizing in the Seattle area. But in my observation, the past decade or so has demonstrated a new level of coordination and power in sex worker organizing. Both of you have been integral to this uptick in sex worker visibility and coalition building. And these have taken many forms, such as direct lobbying efforts for policy change, coalition building with mainstream institution, and organizing internal support structures for harm reduction and survival. So I'd like to know from each of your perspectives, could you talk about the trends that you have seen in terms of sex worker organizing in recent years? And we can talk about Seattle or nationwide or globally, however you want to, but what part have you had and your organizations have had in played in these kinds of these forms of organizing?
I think that one of the I think back to the advocacy work that I've done in Washington specifically, and with the Washington legislature specifically. If I narrow the question a little bit, it's easier for me to get into a little bit more detail. And I'd say that going back 6-7 years ago, the discussion that was being had at the legislature level was, first of all, not including any sex workers, and that it was also very much set based on this end demand model, and that 6 years ago in 2015. At the beginning of 2015, we were in a situation where the legislature was poised to pass 6 bills that would have increased the criminalization of sex work. And it's an interesting place we're in right now, where it's talking to people. People will still have a visceral reaction to the suggestion that we decriminalize sex work, but right now, more and more people are recognizing that criminalizing sex work is not helpful and often harmful. But back in 2015, that's where everything started. And we were looking at these bills being ready to just fly through the legislature with bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats. And there was kind of this turning point moment where Gender Justice League and SWAP in particular organized to get sex workers to the legislature to testify. And again, it came into very much some of the representation problems. Who felt comfortable enough to be able to testify? In that kind of a situation, like even the people who did testify did so under a pseudonym, or even like wearing a disguise to go into the hearing. But nonetheless, it's still very much impacted who was there and who was talking. But there was this wild moment when we all got down there, and the legislature, the committee reorganized their agenda to put the sex work hearing at the bottom of the agenda, and then they ran out the clock to the point where there was only enough time to hear from the 3 advocates for criminalization, and then oops, they were out of time, and all of the sex workers who had traveled down to Olympia were not allowed to testify. And they would pull stuff like that and feel like that was okay. But we managed to get media coverage telling the story about what happened and how sex workers were prevented from testifying on the bill around sex work, and got them to turn around and do another hearing, and then get people to testify. And I look at that now and still see like how far that being able to give your like 2 minute timed testimony before the light goes off and you have to shut up is such a small piece of being involved in the process. But it was the first piece, and it was really important. And it's shifted kind of the conversations to where now we can be more involved in some of these things moving forward. And you see like a shift in what kinds of things are being discussed. 2 years ago, the bill that was able to be passed was something that would make it so that if you are involved in sex work and you call 911 to report a violent crime, and the police come and while investigating that crime they discover you're a sex worker, the bill would would protect you from being prosecuted, so that ostensibly you have this level of safety to be able to at the very least report a violent crime. And that was pretty amazing that there was like something that was not increasing it was not increasing criminalization. It was actually decreasing criminalization in a very small way. Still though, it very purposefully did not protect you from arrest. It only protects you from prosecution. So if the police decided they wanted to arrest you and keep you in jail for 72 hours and really kind of fuck up your life, they could still do that. And also it was only if you're reporting a violent crime. So if you're reporting a crime and they're like, oh, that wasn't violent enough, or if you're reporting a fire, then you don't have that protection. And so we still see those kinds of things happening, and we're like trying to kind of like have this shift, but there really is, there back in 2015 there was a big push, and they kept it going for a couple of years to try and increase criminalization. And they were doing it in this kind of end demand model where it was increasing criminalization for people who are patronizing a prostitute. That was the crime, and that's that they wanted to make it a gross misdemeanor instead of a misdemeanor, that they wanted to have civil forfeiture, where you could lose your car or even your house. And that's not so much being discussed right now. And I think that that's been really important and powerful. I do want to mention, we've talked a bit about end demand in a couple of different ways. And one of the things, especially looking at I guess I'll segue a little bit into the next question here, and say that looking at like a labor justice model, looking at an economic model, this idea of ending demand, it as a buzzword that means, it's not popular to go after sex workers, but it is popular to go after Johns. So like, let's just go after the Johns. Then that as a buzzword will like make some sense to some people, but when you actually look at economically, what does it mean to end demand for a form of labor? What does it mean to end demand for someone's job? Then like take a moment to just think. And the example I like to use, especially being in the Seattle area, we see a lot of tech jobs. We know that there are big tech companies that want to hire a whole bunch of tech workers. And because there is a high demand for tech jobs, tech workers get paid really well. They get to choose which company they're going to work for, They get to name their terms in hiring, get all kinds of like bonuses and different kinds of things like that, which can companies will be creating different perks to try and entice people to come and work for them. And imagine for a moment if we just had a campaign to end demand for tech jobs, where suddenly like it's perfectly legal to work a tech job, but it's illegal to hire a tech worker, and everything has to go underground, and the number of tech jobs is cut down to 10% of what it used to be. Suddenly, the employers aren't going to be competing over workers. It's going to be the workers who are going to have to compete. The employers aren't sex workers coming to have an hour-long talk. The default is not necessarily to include us. And so it makes a really big difference in whatever world you go to, whatever organizing you do, wherever your work takes you, that you think about that and help make space for sex workers wherever there might be an overlap, especially in any kind of like political or policy field.
That's a great place to end our formal panel questions. I want to check in with the panelists, Emmy and Toby. Do you need a short break where we could make a 5-minute break? And if not, okay. If not, I'm good too. Why don't we just open it up to Q&A? I don't actually see any questions in the chat here, but this is a chance, especially for my students. I know that you are all familiar with these issues. I'd love to hear from some of you. Go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And this is also an opportunity for you to unmute yourself and show your face if you want to, and ask these experts your burning questions. It's a great opportunity. Definitely challenging over Zoom because you can't see anyone. It's like, are you there? Please. Oh, good. I have 2 questions. Melissa wrote, what additional resources are needed to support decriminalization efforts? And Anisha wrote, are sex workers protected by the National Relations Act? Let's start with those 2. What additional resources are needed to support decriminalization efforts? Either of you have thoughts on that? Bringing up that history, Emmy, I was also with Emmy in these meetings with council members, and it was just so surreal to have them sort of say, yeah, we agree with you, but basically it's too risky for us politically because there's not going to be enough public support. And then boom, Black Lives Matter rise up, and now suddenly they have the courage to do that. So public opinion matters a lot in terms of these issues. Why don't we move to the next question? Are sex workers protected by the National Relations Act? Toby, do you know, or do either of you know?
My thinking too, like I'm not familiar with this specific law, but I could almost guarantee the answer is no. And even if the answer was yes in some limited way, the reality is that people aren't going to be able to access those protections. Because you would have to out yourself for the kind of work that you do. And most people aren't going to feel safe doing that. And if you did do that, you wouldn't be safe. Like, so yeah, no, like I'll tell you, like, I even know multiple examples in the past few years where someone was like trying to take legal action against an abuser, and the abuser threw back like, well, this person does sex work. And the police said, well, you can push forward these charges against your abuser, but if you do, we might also have to arrest you. And so, suddenly, all right, I'm not going to push charges against my abuser. And I think it's going to be the same kind of thing that, like, hypothetically, everyone is protected by laws against violence, but in reality, you're not if you're a sex worker, and the police are going to charge you as well. And I think the same thing for any kind of national labor protections. If you have any protections even if hypothetically on the letter of the law you have those protections, the reality is that you won't be able to actually access them.
More questions? I think we can take 4 if anybody else wants to add a final question. We're going to go to Akshara. What can be done to help improve access to important health services for sex workers? Either of you want to jump in on that?
I'll just say that a couple of different things. One, a really basic thing is the same things that make health services inaccessible to everyone else. There's a lot of things that make health services inaccessible to people, especially based on like income, and so doing work for better access to health services, doing work for a better yeah, all different kinds of stuff like that can be helpful. But then two, also the other thing that's really important in a practical sense is a lot of health services people, it's going to be like an iffy situation to talk about the reality of your work. Again, it's going to be, people are going to feel unsafe talking about what's going on in their lives, and that's going to make it harder to get access to services, and they're going to feel unsafe for good reason. That like if you do talk openly about what's going on in your life, there's a good chance that your healthcare provider is not going to be understanding or supportive of you as a person, and may make that harder. So I think that yeah, those are the two areas, the things that are going to make health services more accessible to everyone, and then the thing of like just helping like change the cultural level of understanding and the individual level of understanding for people who are providing health services. I'd say that there might be a few areas for specific services that it might be helpful to create sex worker specific services, or create specific carve-outs for sex workers accessing health services. But the really big picture stuff, I kind of see those two main things. There are a few specific things, and I've definitely seen a lot from my work in the porn industry, where there is like, you know, porn specific health clinics, and sex worker specific mental health services, and those are usually like created by sex workers, by people in the industry, and that can be really powerful, but also pretty small and having their own limitations.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up. The next question has to do with COVID. We talked earlier about how much COVID is affecting the trans community. Are there any organizations that are currently stepping in to help? And then the final question is, are there volunteer opportunities at Eileen's? How can we support the center? Tobi, do you want to take the lead on the first question?
Yeah. So Gender Justice League has been doing a lot of work around this, and I'll point to 2 things, and maybe a third. But one is we have our program supporting survivors of gender-based violence, and we have funding through the city to provide financial assistance to people who are survivors of gender-based violence, and so we've been using that to help people cover rent, or other basic needs, that especially if or you know, help someone have, you know, some money to cover their needs as they're escaping a violent situation, or even just if someone's like experienced violence a few years ago, but they're like dealing with the repercussions of it now and they just lost their job. There's some financial support that we are able to provide to people. Additionally, we created a partnership with Heart Spark Press and Unite Olympia to do the Hugs Food Pantry, where we all were working with the Thurston County Food Bank to be able to get food deliveries specifically to trans people in the Olympia and Thurston County area. That was a really amazing program that was pulled together with really minimal funding. That funding is now gone, and so are the volunteers who were running it. So it would be lovely to try and get that back up again, but it's going to require funding for like paid organizers as well. But the third thing that we're looking at potentially doing is, there are a lot of resources throughout the state that are doing COVID response in different ways. And we just applied for a grant that would help provide additional financial assistance to our community members, and specifically BIPOC trans folks and rural trans folks throughout Washington state. And if we get access, if we get that grant, that's going to be a huge difference. But it's like that's the kind of there's a lot of different organizations that are stepping up in different ways to do that. And it might not be like trans specific, and part of the role that we take is to try and connect our trans communities to those resources, and when possible, like get some of those resources directly run through us to be able to be trans specific, at least in a small little operations part of it.
Thank you, Toby. And, Gender Justice League, I'm just always so impressed with the breadth of work that you do, from policy to direct action like this. So thank you so much. Ends our event. Thank you so much to Emmy Koyama and Tobi Hill-Meyer. I think all of us have learned a lot from both of you. It's been very powerful to be in this conversation with you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. To my students, I will be in touch with you. We'll formally end the class now. I'll be in touch with you via email. To everyone else, feel free to keep in touch with me if you're not part of my class. Thank you to Simon for all the help in terms of tech and organizing the links. Thank you to Chen for organizing the entire colloquium series. And we'll give you all an applaud. And we're all on mute, but thank you so much. Toby, I hope that you can jump back into your vacation now unscathed. I know you only have 2 days there on the Oregon coast. Thanks again for joining us in the middle of this. And Emmy, thank you as always. It's always a pleasure. All right.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.
Bye.